Good afternoon. My name is Man Wang. I'm director with the Washington State China Relations Council. Thank you for joining us today for a discussion on the impacts of supply chain issue in the Pacific Northwest in the US. We're delighted to have three experts share their insights on this issue. Annette Sandberg is CEO of TransSafe Consulting LLC, which provides transportation, public safety, and security services to public and private organizations dealing with regulatory policy compliance, implementation, and management of complex transportation and safety programs. Annette became the second administrator of the Federal Motor Carrier Administration, FMCA, in 2003, following her confirmation by the Senate. Prior to that, she served as the Deputy Administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Annette also led the Washington State Patrol as chief for 6 years, from 1995 to 2001. She was the first woman to lead a state police agency. Tong Ju is Chief Commercial Officer and the Chief Strategy Officer at the Northwest Seaport Alliance, a marine cargo operating partnership of the Port of Seattle and Port of Tacoma. Tong also served as the Chief Commercial Officer at the Port of Tacoma from 2010 to 2015. Before joining the Port of Tacoma, Tong managed international relations at the Port of Seattle and directed the state of Washington's Greater China Trade Development Programs. She serves on the boards of the Washington State China Relations Council, the Japan American Society of the State of Washington, and the Evergreen Building Products Association. Our moderator today is Spencer Cohen, principal and founder of High Peak Strategy LLC, an international trade and economics research consulting firm based in Seattle. He consults and writes extensively on international trade, China's economy, industry clusters, and regional economic analysis. Prior to forming High Peak Strategy, he served as a senior economist with a Seattle-based economics consulting firm. He has also held policy and research roles with the state of Washington. Spencer is a 2021 to 2023 Public Intellectuals Program Fellow with the National Committee on U.S. China Relations and an affiliate professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Washington. For today's program, Spencer, Annette, and Tong will provide brief comments on current supply chain challenges from the perspectives of inflation, the tracking system, and port operations respectively, and then followed by moderated and audience Q&As. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. I'll post our channel's link in the chat box momentarily. You can also find some of our past event recordings there. Our next event will be next Tuesday, March 15th, with experts discussing a critical issue that the world has been tracking with great concerns, the Ukraine crisis. Our discussion will focus on China's reactions and implications. I'll post the event link in the chat box as well, so hope you can join us. Lastly, please make sure to stay muted throughout the session. If you have questions for the speakers, please type them in the chat box and they will be addressed during the audience Q&A session. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Spencer.
Thank you, Ma, and thank you to the China Relations Council for the opportunity to share my thoughts and also participate with the two other esteemed speakers today. I'm going to share my screen. So what I'd like to talk about in my comments today is really the relationship between the supply chain disruptions we're experiencing and inflation, which has obviously been a big interest to everyone of late, and it's been really covered extensively in the news. So there are really two ways to track inflation, at least federally. So there's what's called consumer price index, and then there's what's called personal consumption expenditures. And the core PC and core CPI are really when they strip away energy and food, which are typically the most volatile prices. And we've seen, especially with the Ukraine crisis, that there's been a lot of disruptions and big, disruptions and ripple effects in the energy markets that we're experiencing at the gas pump. The CPI is generated through a survey of consumers, and the PCE is generated through a survey of businesses in terms of what prices they charge. And the Federal Reserve typically likes their preferred measure would be what's called the core PCE, and that's what they typically use to inform interest rate policy. But across all these different measures, what you can clearly see, and you've all seen in the news, is there's been a significant uptick in inflation in the last several months. Right now, as of February of 2022, headline CPI is about 8%, and headline PCE is about 6%. And even if you strip away energy and food prices, they're still at relatively historic highs. In fact, for the headline CPI, as you can see, it's actually the highest it's been since the 1980s, when we experienced what would be considered to be, for the US in recent history, a very high inflation, upwards of over 10%. That's the same story relatively we've been experiencing in the Seattle region as well. So as of the end of 2021, CPI within the Seattle region was close to 8%. There's a lot of factors playing into that, but a lot of the same dynamics are at play in terms of constrained supply chains and wage increases that are helping to drive that growth. So there are really four basic or common theories about inflation that have been proffered in the media, and I'd like to unpack them a little bit in this talk. The first two that I will discuss very briefly to start with, the bottom two. So one argument is that what's really causing inflation is excess liquidity, that there's more money chasing the same or fewer amount of goods in the economy, and that's what's driving a lot of this growth in prices. We had the Fed stimulus is the main culprit in according to this theory. 3 rounds of stimulus between 2020 and 2021, with about $5 trillion and $3.6 trillion in actual outlays. The problem with this is just that that a lot of the Fed stimulus was actually in lieu of lost wages. So it was not exactly additive to people's spending power. People had lost a lot of their income because of the pandemic, at least temporarily. And then according to the San Francisco Fed, most recently, the last round of stimulus, which was $1.9 trillion, will likely contribute about 0.3 percentage points to price inflation in 2022. So it does have an inflationary impact, especially the last round, but it doesn't really represent the vast majority of those price increases. The other argument at the bottom is tariffs. We experienced the trade war in 2018, 2019. The trade war in the tariffs that were applied to Chinese goods were ultimately largely borne by US households, because those are consumer goods. And that had a big impact on the consumers, and inflation on those consumers being forced to pay a higher price for things that they generally needed, because these were what we consider to be largely inelastic goods, many of which are produced overseas in China. The problem with that theory, though, is that there's a timing mismatch. Those tariffs were enacted in 2018, 2019, and inflation really took off towards the tail end of 2021. So the two main culprits, in my view, are really the tight labor market we're experiencing and supply chain disruptions, which we'll talk more extensively about with my two colleagues. With respect to tight labor markets, we're seeing that there's a big imbalance we're experiencing between demand for workers and availability or supply of workers. Many workers exited the workforce during the pandemic, at least among those low-wage services-based jobs. We saw as a result that there was a big uptick in wages year over year in 2021, in Q4 about 5%. And the median wage in January grew about 5.1%, which is the biggest increase since 2002. So that creates a demand-driven, what we consider to be a demand-driven factor with price increases. The other factor is supply chain disruptions. COVID really upended supply chains and shifted a lot of consumption patterns. We saw that a lot of factory closures, especially among manufacturing hubs, where we import a lot of goods, such as specifically China, but also Vietnam, Malaysia, and elsewhere. Even small components that are relatively small to the product they go into, these intermediate components, if they're not available, can essentially render that product unmanufacturable. And that's specifically the case with semiconductors in the auto sector. We also had shifting in consumption patterns. As more people were unable to spend their income in restaurants and services, or didn't want to, they shifted more of that consumption to physical goods. And a lot of those physical goods through e-commerce are generally imported. So that creates more stress on the supply chains, more stress in logistics, that create what was already a relatively fragile supply chain system, which my two colleagues will talk about, that really created a lot of stress and exposed a lot of vulnerabilities. So quickly, just looking at wages, we saw that the labor force participation rate fell pretty precipitously during the pandemic and is only now recovering. And then in the green line is wages. And naturally expect to see that wages would be going up when you have a big constraint or contraction in the amount of people in the labor force. We also saw during the pandemic that a lot of retailers in the US opted not to replenish their existing inventories. So as a result, when demand picked up, a lot of those retailers very rapidly depleted those existing inventories. And when you had a sudden concentration of many retailers in the US wanting to increase their inventories again, that created a very jarring impact on the supply chain. And we saw a lot of shortages resulting from that impact. As I mentioned, e-commerce was already on the upswing and was increasing gradually in the aughts in 2010s into the 2020s. But that increase became a piecemeal sudden increase or jarring increase during the pandemic, again, because most people were not able to actually go spend money at stores or go physically to restaurants. So in addition to not losing some of that purchasing power, but then replenished because of the stimulus, a lot of people shifted their consumption from services-based products, services-based consumption to physical goods. And most of those physical goods are going to be imported, especially household electronics, household goods, other kinds of physical goods. Again, putting more and more sudden and unanticipated stress on an already fragile supply chain logistics system. So we did see as a result in 2021, many of us have probably seen the pictures in the news of the backlogs. We saw that LA Long Beach, which is the largest port system in the US for container goods, had a historic high backlog with about 100 vessels that were waiting to unload, either anchored or even adrift in San Pedro Bay, waiting to come into, to dock to unload. 77% of ports globally in 2021 experienced abnormally long times for turnaround traffic. We also saw that a lot of the that same volume increases were also happening at the Pacific Northwest at Northwest Seaport Alliance. And that also affects the warehouse space. So a lot of times there was simply not, in addition to other shortages like trucking shortages and so forth, there simply many times was not available warehouse vacancy or space to move boxes for transloading in distribution centers and to reformat that cargo for distribution. So all these things in and of themselves continue to have ripple effects that further kind of confounded and expounded these kind of challenges and compounded them. This really matters for Washington State. We are the most trade-dependent state in the country, and many of our manufacturers are heavily reliant upon imported components as a key element of their manufacturing process. Not just aerospace, but other kinds of manufacturing, primary metal manufacturing, printing, and so forth, all rely to a large degree on imported components. And so when these businesses are not able to import on time, whether it's semiconductors or materials or intermediate goods, they are not able to complete production. There are delays. It affects their suppliers domestically as well, and so forth, as well as their consumers. So it has a very outsized impact on our businesses. So lastly, just want to touch briefly on the long-term impacts before we get into a discussion later. One thing, if we think more long-term about inflation, I think the current bout will subside, and I think many economists believe that, but there are some structural challenges that are longer term in nature that will affect prices. For a long time, US consumers were the beneficiaries of a large glut of cheap labor globally, primarily in China, but elsewhere as well. But we're now seeing that especially in China, that low-cost manufacturing base or workforce is beginning to contract. It's in decline. We no longer have the excess supply of rural underemployed workers shifting from the farm to the city to the manufacturing center. Chinese wages were 26 times cheaper than US wages right at the precipice of China joining the WTO. That's now just 4 times as cheap as the US. Aging populations globally are also taking effect. That means less saving and more consuming. Birth rates are also in decline globally. And then we are seeing the continued rise of e-commerce increasingly as a mainstay of how we consume. So these are just longer term impacts, and I'll turn it over to Annette now to talk a bit about the supply chain system in logistics.
Thank you, Spencer. I'm going to share my screen here. So I've been asked to speak primarily about the trucking piece. Hopefully you can see that, see my screen there. So from a trucking perspective, and I'm going to look at it from a national, and then I'll narrow it down more towards Washington State. But one of the key things from a trucking perspective, and I clearly dealt with this a lot when I was at the U.S. Department of Transportation, is that at some point a truck is going to touch pretty much every piece of freight in the United States. And so it's important to understand the freight corridors and where those major freight corridors are. We continually looked at freight corridors when we looked at various trucking issues when I was back in Washington, D.C. And this is a pretty good map, even though it's old. You can see that it's a 2013 map from the Federal Highway Administration of where the major freight corridors are in the United States. And you can see most of those center around major port operations. And so the thing that we always looked at is we would look at these freight corridors and then try to determine what truck capacity would be within those various freight corridors. And the reason that we looked at that is obviously when you start considering congestion in some of those corridors, it becomes really important related to trucking, particularly as you look at trucking hours of service. So trucks are regulated heavily. Their hours that they're allowed to drive and work within a certain period of time are also regulated. So let's go to the next slide. This slide shows bottlenecks. And I thought that this one was particularly important because if you remember those corridors that we looked at in the previous slide, you'll see where some of the heaviest bottlenecks in the country are. And this is pre-pandemic. So before the pandemic ever happened, we were having problems with the bottlenecks occurring in some of these heavy freight corridors. And this was extremely important from a trucking perspective, and particularly for trucking companies, is they try to avoid these bottleneck areas if possible, because their drivers lose so many hours if they're stuck in these areas. So this is where I'll narrow down to Washington State, and you'll see that Washington actually has seven.
Annette,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt, but we didn't see the bottleneck slide.
Oh, okay. Let me go back.
They didn't. We still have the corridors up on the screen.
How about
Okay.
How about that one?
That did it.
Now, can you see it?
Yes.
Sorry about that. So here's the bottleneck slide. Sorry about that. And you can see these are states that have the highest number of bottlenecks in the top 100 bottlenecks in the country. And you see that Washington is up there. We're not as bad as Texas, but we're clearly, Texas has 14 bottlenecks, Georgia 9, Tennessee 9, California 8, Washington State has 7. And so those bottlenecks become very problematic as it relates to movement of freight through the state. So let me go to the next one here. Let me know if you don't see this one. Oops. Okay. Now, do you see Washington State?
Yeah, Washington State.
Okay. These are the 7 bottlenecks specifically in Washington. And you can see that most of them are centered on the I-5 corridor, but obviously a bulk of them are in the Seattle-Tacoma area. And then obviously there's one down by Vancouver at the Columbia River. But these bottlenecks are important from a trucking perspective, because trucking companies, they have to be cautious when they send their drivers into, let's say, Seattle or Tacoma to pick up loads and then to move out. They have to make sure that they have enough hours left in their day before they start that trip. Otherwise, the driver has to stop partway through the day. The other problem that we see here in Washington, and I know that the legislature and Washington Department of Transportation have been working on this, has to do with truck parking. Because if a driver goes into, let's say, the Port of Seattle, picks up a load, and they lose enough hours waiting for a load at the port, which they may, depending on what the backup or the dwell time is, then by the time they get out of the port and just barely leave Seattle, they have to have a place to park in order to get their 10 hours rest. And so that becomes extremely important. But as far as overall trucking challenges, and hopefully you can see this, I just want to step back a second. And if you think about the bottlenecks, the congestion, the freight corridors, there's kind of an even bigger problem that's happening related to trucking. So as many people have heard, there's a huge driver shortage. And people think, well, why is there a driver shortage? If you look over on the left side of this slide, you look at truckers by age. This has been an issue that's been approaching trucking in the United States for a number of years. So 57% of truckers in the workforce right now, these are truckers that are actually working, not people that hold commercial driver's license, but people are actually driving truck, are over the age of 45. And 23% are over the age of 55, and only 20% are under 45. So you see that we have a very high aging workforce, and we're starting to see drivers exit that workforce without enough younger drivers coming in. Second problem we have is that if a driver is operating in interstate commerce, so if they're picking up anything from the port, that's going to be considered interstate commerce, they have to be at least 21 years of age. And so from a trucking perspective, what we see is we lose drivers, because oftentimes when you get people into these types of jobs, you want to catch them right as they're leaving high school. We lose drivers from the age of 18 to 21 to other sectors of the workforce. So they either go into construction, other types of even warehousing, things like that, because they can do those jobs. They don't have to be 21 to do those jobs. And at that point, they're not necessarily going to leave a job like that and then go into trucking. There are a number of other impacts, which I'll stay kind of over on the left-hand side of this slide. Very interesting, and this has been an ongoing problem. Women only make up 7% of all truck drivers in this country. And obviously that's not representative of the amount of women that are available in the workforce. And so trucking has been trying to find ways to make these jobs more attractive. The hiring standards for truck drivers, it's dependent on their driving record. And obviously, if the driver needs to have a transportation worker identification credential, a TWIC card, then there's a criminal record check that also goes into play. And so those two things eliminate some people out of the workforce. And then the most recent problem that we've had has to do with drug testing. Now, drug testing has always been in place for the trucking industry. However, in the year 2020, a national drug and alcohol clearinghouse went into place. And so now every time a driver gets tested, if they test positive, that test goes into this national clearinghouse. And before somebody can hire a new truck driver, they have to check that clearinghouse. Just because of the advent of the clearinghouse, we eliminated a pretty significant percentage of truck drivers that were kind of evading some testing issues, and now they're getting caught. The second problem with drug testing that we're seeing has to do with the legalization of marijuana in a lot of states. So though marijuana is legal, it's not legal for truck drivers. And so drivers may think, hey, it's legal in my state, I can smoke some marijuana. They go into work the next day and they get pulled for a random test. If they test positive, then they're out. So that's been a problem. The second problem we've seen, and I've seen this with a lot of the trucking companies I work with, has to do with the use of CBD. And so drivers think that it's okay, but that's not regulated. And all of a sudden they'll use it for back pain or something like that. They get tested for random and then they test positive for THC. And so we're seeing some drivers getting shaken out because of those issues. But then over on the kind of the broader perspective for the driver workforce, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, congestion impacts on hours of service. So drivers can only drive a certain period of time within a work clock. And one of the things that I heard from a lot of my clients, particularly those that were working at the Port of LA Long Beach last year, some drivers would wait for 8 hours to just get in to go get a container to get out. By the time they make that one turn, they're out of hours and their day's over. Now, keep in mind, there's only a small percentage of drivers, about 20% at the ports, that are hourly employees. And so most of those drivers are paid by the turn or by the load. And if they can only make one load, then it's not worth it to them to work at a port or to do that drayage operation. I'm on the board of directors for a trucking company, and we had trouble convincing drivers to go pick up loads at the port. They would prefer to take loads anywhere else rather than go pick up at the port because they knew that they would lose hours at the port. And then the last issue really has to do with chassis and trucking shortages. And I know we're going to talk about chassis shortages in a bit, but there's probably about 10 or 15 companies that I've been working with that simply cannot buy a truck right now. So a lot of trucking companies that had orders for new trucks, those orders have been pushed out 2, 3, and 4 quarters. And I have some companies that have actually had orders for new trucks that have been pushed out into 2023 and beyond. Most recently, and I'll just do an anecdotal, I had a large company come to me. They ship a lot of goods in from China, and they were their goods were kept at the port or they were stored in warehouses, and they couldn't get them to their final distribution center because they couldn't get the trucking capacity. So they thought, we're going to go develop our own trucking company. They asked me to help them get a DOT number. They were going to go get trucks. They had found a way to go buy about 15 chassis, and they were going to move their own containers. The problem was they couldn't find trucks anywhere in the United States that they could buy, and they had cash in hand to go buy a new truck, but they couldn't get it. So we had to find a way to get trucking capacity for them in a different way. But those trucking shortages and the chassis shortages are really having a huge impact as well. And with that, I will turn it over. Let's see, I'll stop sharing here. To Tom.
Thank you, Annette. Thank you, Man, for helping me put up the slides. Interesting presentation. Thank you so much for the insight, and thanks, Spencer, for additional insight that I've learned about inflation and about what's leading up to this perfect storm. So the current supply chain crisis, to me, is really a textbook example of how a perfect storm of factors can lead to the mother of all supply chain disruptions. Spencer mentioned about the trade war, so let me just touch on that. What we have seen today is really part of something much bigger that began in 2018 with the escalation of the trade war between the US and China. These punitive tariffs set into motion of changes in manufacturing and sourcing patterns that have been amplified through the global pandemic. The chaos we have experienced over the last couple of years has changed the supply chain forever. And I can tell you firsthand that no one in the supply chain has been spared. Everybody has been affected, including our US consumers. Next slide, please. And I'm sure all of you have read that importers are paying ridiculously high container shipping rates, 10,000 to 15,000 for a 40-foot container imported from Asia. And to put things in perspective, rates between Shanghai and LA are roughly 6,600 year over year, an increase of 151%. Basically, in 2020, importers could be paying roughly $4,500, and today they're paying $11,000 for a 40-foot container. Containers are emptied at ports and cycled back to Asia as quickly as possible to meet the strong import demand, oftentimes leaving US exports behind. The huge influx of empty returns to Asia has overwhelmed our terminals, adding to the terminal congestion. Next slide, please. I think Spencer touched on this. Terminals are highly congested, limiting their ability to move containers within the terminal and causing berthing delays for ships. This slide shows vessel waiting for berths over the last 6 months. I think Spencer mentioned it. I'm sure all of you have heard about the situation in LA and Long Beach. And one time they had as many as 112 vessels waiting for a berth. They have been able to work that down to around 60 during the Chinese New Year holiday. And I think when I looked at it last Friday, it was about 50 some. I'm happy to share that the current backlog in our gateway is down to only a few vessels, less than a handful, 3 or 4. Frankly, I have to say that we are the best performing gateway on the West Coast. That includes Vancouver, BC, and Prince Rupert. We're still better performing than them. Many importers are paying additional charges for long dwelling containers on top of demurrage charges. A container filled with 20,000 worth of consumer products may be charged as much as 20,000 additional fee. The question is, who foots the bill? It's you and me, the consumers. Annette spent time explaining the trucking sector. I totally agree with her insight. The trucking sector was already struggling with a shortage of labor before COVID. I think COVID has made it worse. For shippers and consumers, higher freight rates and shipping delays now mean higher prices and supply issues at your local store. Supply chain disruption is going to have long-lasting impacts on retail distribution and the supply chain, at the overall supply chain. Many retailers were caught short of inventories. I'm sure all of you have witnessed that. There is now a shift taking place from just in time to just in case on the ground inventory. This is going to drive up demand for warehouse and distribution space near port gateways and create some new opportunities for the Puget Sound area. So how has the supply chain crisis impacted our gateway? Our container volumes were up 12.5% in 2021 to 3.7 million TEUs, nearly back to pre-pandemic level back in 2019. Full imports were up about almost 17%, while full exports were down about 12%. You may wonder, if we were handling around the same volume as we did in 2019, then why are things so congested? Imagine this. You're filling a bottle with a funnel, pouring water in at a constant rate. All of a sudden, you dump twice the amount of water into that funnel. Of course, it's going to overflow, and that's what we're experiencing. Terminals are designed to operate at around 80 to 85% utilization. During the crisis, we have been operating at more than 100%. Some terminals are operating at utilization of 110%. This limits terminal efficiency and the volume they can handle. Next slide, please. Terminal congestion is not simply a terminal issue. It is everyone's issue. Carriers, importers, exporters, truckers, railroads, port authorities. We're fully engaged To help alleviate terminal congestions, we have converted parcels near marine terminals in Seattle and Tacoma to store containers, empty containers or full containers. We're actively looking for additional land or acreage in the Puget Sound area to expand our off-dock handling capacity. You have also probably heard about Terminal 5 in our Seattle Harbor. It opened for business this January. The modernized terminal has added much needed terminal berth and yard capacity and builds on our existing big ship handling capabilities. And we have a team of folks, business development folks are devoted to work with our shippers who control most of the volume and work in partnership with our terminal operators on solutions to help expedite the removal of loaded imports from our terminals. And we have been actively engaging with our carrier customers to encourage deployment of sweeper vessels to pick up non-dwelling empties or consider other means to address this challenging issue. We're not out of the woods yet, but these initiatives are helping to manage the congestion that we have been experiencing in the gateway. So where are we headed? Just last week, I returned from the JOC's TPM, Trans-Pacific Maritime Conference in Long Beach. It is considered the leading industry event for ports, carriers, and retailers and supply chain partners. Of course, one of the most important question in everybody's mind was, how long is this situation going to last? Frankly speaking, it might be a while. Consumer demand is still strong. Forecasts are for more moderate import growth, but with volumes at the same high levels over the first half of this year, it is going to make for a challenging environment. Most industry experts are suggesting it will be late in the second half of 2020 or maybe into 2023 before things approach normal. I think that completes my presentation. Thank you for the time.
Well, thank you, Annette and Tong. And I have a couple questions I'm going to ask both of you, and then we can also open it up for audience Q&A as well. So my first question is to Annette, and I wonder if you could unpack a little more some of the trucking shortages we've heard about. You mentioned, you provided a really thorough explanation of the rationale, or the reasons or factors behind trucking shortages and the impact on supply chain. Are there specific subsectors, for instance, or areas of trucking, for instance, between drayage and long haul, where you're seeing that impact more acute? And then a follow-on to that would be, are you seeing also, you mentioned about the issues around, like, the backlog at the ports in 8-hour waiting times that truckers are not allowed to, they can only maybe get one turn, if that, in the day. Are you seeing that on the other side too, at the warehouses? Because we're seeing so much like congestion and loss of vacancy. And I have one last added amendment to that question too. Sorry, just technical. That just came to me was when you talk too about the cost on the trucker. I'm just curious, like, if you work for a trucking company, is that cost borne by the company if you're not able to do a turn, or is it still borne by the driver either way? So that's a lot to ask and packed in one question, but if you could have some brief comments and reply to those, that'd be great.
Sure, I'll start with, I'll try to answer everything. I think I remember it. So if you look at the trucking sector, where we've seen the greatest churn, and that's one thing that you'll find in the trucking sector, there are a finite number of drivers and they churn from one company to another. So drivers are constantly chasing pay, and some companies are offering as much as a $10,000 bonus to move over. You generally have to stay for a year. Driver will move over, stay there for a year, get their $10,000, and then go to another company to try to get another 10,000. So we're seeing a lot of churn of drivers in the same, the same amount of drivers in the same pool. But where we see the biggest problem is really in long haul and then drayage. Long haul for a couple of reasons. One, it's not really great work. Drivers are gone for weeks at a time. They live out of their truck. So if you've ever been in a sleeper berth of a truck, or if you haven't, I challenge you to go get in one. They're not a very good environment to have to live in. Some guys like it, but it is a hard segment to recruit for. And the second, on drayage, the reason for the problems at drayage is the amount of wait time. So, and even on the long haul, it's really important that people understand a majority of drivers are paid by the mile, or if they're doing drayage, they're paid by the turn. And so you think about those congestion choke points. If you're sitting in traffic, you're not moving, and that means you're not making money. And so drivers hate to run routes that they're going to get caught in traffic in Seattle during rush hour for 2 hours where they're sitting, not making any money. Same with all those other choke points around the country. Drivers will try to find routes or runs that they can run where they're actually going to be moving and their wheels will continue to turn. So if a driver is not making money, it's really the driver that bears that. A majority of drivers in the United States are independent contractors. So even though they might work for a specific trucking company, they are considered independent contractors, and therefore they bear the burden if they're not making money. We do see problems on the backside. So let's say it's a warehouse where they're supposed to go deliver. Trucking companies have really worked hard with shippers and receivers to set up appointments. But what we see is that appointments get blown a lot. So a driver will show up, they'll have an appointment time, and they'll sit and wait 2 hours. Even though their appointment was for 10 o'clock, they might not get unloaded until 12, and they lose all that time that they're not moving. I know that there's been some move in Washington, D.C. to talk about charging detention. And that's if a driver has an appointment and that appointment gets missed, whoever causes the miss of that appointment would have to pay detention. But keep in mind, just like everything else, it's going to be you and I, the consumer, that ends up paying that cost. I mean, it's got to come from somewhere in the system. So that's probably the big problem right now with drivers.
Well, thank you.
Was there something else I was supposed to hit there?
No, that was great. That was very complete.
Okay.
Thank you. Tong, I have a question for you. So you provided a really informative overview and discussion about the backlog and the impacts to LA Long Beach and the difference with LA Long Beach and the Northwest Seaport Alliance, and how you're actually, I think you mentioned only 5 vessels right now, or less than 5 are in backlog of 4. So if you factor in the congestion at LA Long Beach and how that's just historic in nature, and then you also pair that too, though, with countervailing forces of potentially shifting supply chains, where do you see opportunities for the Northwest Seaport Alliance? In other words, like, do you see that the Seaport Alliance, even though terminal operator investments are very sticky and they're on long-term leases, do you see areas where there could be some of that traffic that could potentially move to the Northwest Seaport Alliance? And if you could elaborate a little bit on where there might be opportunities for the Northwest.
You bet. Thank you, Spencer. And I will, if you don't mind, let me comment on Annette's reference about the 8 hours. It is definitely not our port. It's not Seattle, Tacoma. I want to assure everyone that when Annette mentioned that, I quickly pulled up our stats. I want to say we're averaging, I'm not proud of this, but we are averaging about 1 to 2 hours, the entire gateway, that's Seattle, Tacoma on average. So much less than 8 hours. And I hope we'll never, ever get to that 8 hour marker. Coming back to you, Spencer, thank you for that question. I will say this: anything that presents a challenge for PSW ports is an opportunity for us. And Shippers are absolutely taking a fresh look at port gateways due to vessel delays in LA and Long Beach. Discretionary cargo, essentially freight bound for the Midwest that can move between gateways, has always been a focus of ours. We have great ocean connections, a strong on-dock rail product to support that business. We're in constant contact with all of the major importers, and these efforts are definitely paying off. Just this week, we received word that a medium-sized BCO has decided to shift 100% of its import cargo to our gateway away from LA and Long Beach. And also just last week, we just secured another monthly international service to our gateway. Frankly, away from LA and Long Beach. I would say one of our key competitive advantages is the availability of industrial warehousing and transload activity here in the Puget Sound area compared to other gateway. We think this will become even more important as importers diversify ports and warehouse footprint to support e-commerce, the growing e-commerce business. Thank you, Spencer.
Thank you, Tom. Annette, you have a unique background and really interesting background. You were a former administrator and deputy administrator for 2 different federal agencies. So I'd love to get your insights into, based on your experience, and be it in trucking policies specific to trucking or just more broadly around supply chains and logistics, what are the areas you think that the federal government, where can the federal government intervene in a positive way and productively to try to help alleviate some of this? And also, what are the limitations or the limits on what the federal government can do?
So that's a good question. One of the things I learned back in DC is that nothing happens quickly. And that's the problem. With this supply chain problem, we really needed things to happen quickly, and they just couldn't. Regulations take forever to work through, but probably the biggest problem, and this is one that's been coming for a lot of years, and I think it's one that needs to be addressed both at the national and the state level, and that has to do with our infrastructure, because our infrastructure is very, very old. If you look at the interstate system, the bridges, our roadways, we have not been building new roadways. It may seem to people like we're building roads all the time, but we're really not. We're just trying to patch up the ones that we already have. We haven't added additional capacity, and we certainly haven't added additional capacity when you look at from the port to the highway. So those, and I know that you can speak to this, is that there's so much infrastructure that we have ignored or just pushed off down the road. And so I think from both a federal level, both at the US DOT as well as Congress and the state level, is really we need to start focusing on investing in our infrastructure, because we're not going to work our way out of this problem. Congestion continues to grow and it gets worse every year. But if we don't start building more roads and looking at multimodal, I think is one partial answer, but obviously rail doesn't go everywhere. And sometimes people get too impatient to have whatever they want to be transported by rail. But I think we need to look for more opportunities to look across all modes of transportation to move our goods.
I'd like to ask a similar question to Tom about, in the fall, and I know you're obviously not from LA Long Beach, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit about this, how in the fall, the Biden administration announced plans to expand operations at LA Long Beach to 24/7, but that not actually materially happen. And what, from your perspective too, what is it the government can do with respect to terminal operations? I know there was talk about demurrage and perhaps reducing demurrage fees, if that's correct. What, from your perspective, like what is it the federal government is realistically able to do?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I was going to echo what Annette just said that I think the federal government, through funding and investment in infrastructure, can really help give ports the boost they need. And when I think about infrastructure, aside from what Annette mentioned, the land side, water side, channel deepening, I'm also thinking of digital infrastructure, right? We need to have a robust national, hopefully national, freight IT platform so that we can give all the stakeholders necessary visibility that they're asking for, so they can track their cargo, so cargo can be moved more efficiently through different modes of transportation. I see that as, frankly, a role of federal government. Now, you mentioned about this 24/7, why didn't it happen? Here's my perspective. I think the concept sounds good, yet the implementation of it would require coordination and, frankly, commitment from all stakeholders, not just truckers, not just ports, not just warehouses, including importers and many other stakeholders that are involved in the supply chain.
Thank you. Well, I would like to open it up to questions from the audience. So if anyone has any specific questions they'd like to ask, this is a great opportunity to do so. And you can either raise your hand or I guess, or put it in the chat box as well. We actually do have a question from Jonathan Pan. So it says, this is a question to Annette. What can we do in logistics to ask the U.S. government to lift the ELD mandate or extend ELD restrictions beyond the 11-hour day? Most truckers state that the ELD restriction has reduced their productivity by 33% with traffic and port congestion. So, Annette, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. I hate to say this, but I don't think that they'll ever lift it. So the ELD is the electronic logging device, which came into play in 2019. And that really locks truckers down to ensure that they don't exceed 11 hours a day. But just remember that the 11-hour, I was actually at DOT when we implemented the 11-hour rule. It used to be truck drivers could only drive 10. So to go from 10 to 11, I can tell you that we had litigation that went on for about 3 years, challenging that extension of drive time. But the rule that we put in place was really, it's based on safety. So if you think about it, do you really want a truck driver driving more than 11 hours a day? And the safety data that we had at the time said that 11 is getting close to the max. And the drivers need to have some restorative rest before they exceed that. So I think given that safety data and the desire of the federal government to reduce highway fatalities, I don't see them extending that 11 beyond what's already allowed.
Are there other questions?
Thank you very much. And I do have one more thing to follow up. I did talk to a national chain trucker that was in our office today. And he said, with the ELD mandate, you have seen higher fatality or higher accident because drivers are rushed to finish that 11-day work days. 11-hour.
So there have been an increase in fatalities. However, DOT just released their data the other day that there was actually a reduction in truck-related fatalities last year. Now, some of that may have been just traffic related because traffic counts were down overall. I know that some drivers feel rushed. I know that most trucking companies are trying to make sure that the routes that they give the drivers, they can complete within their regular hours of service. And they're also trying to provide other incentives. But I know a lot of independent contractors, they'll try to push those hours in order to get additional miles and things like that. I don't think that there's much that they can do about that other than to try to, I know that there's a regulation in place right now to talk about speed limiters and putting speed limiters on trucks to keep them from driving faster. That doesn't necessarily mean that at a 45-mile-an-hour zone that you keep them at 45. But I think some of the things that the trucking companies are doing, cameras in the trucks, the speed limiters, automatic speed warnings, those kinds of things, they're trying to make sure that their drivers drive within the hours and still drive safely. But there are those that will always skirt the regulations. And I think those are the kinds of drivers that we have to be careful that we don't necessarily want in the system.
So we have about 2 minutes left, but if it's okay with Annette and Tong, if we could stand a little longer, I know we have a few questions. So if people are willing to stay on, that'd be great. Nor, you had a question. Do you want to ask that you're next in line? Or you're on mute.
Okay, a very, very simple question, and that is, we talked about the issue of not recruiting high schoolers into the industry. Are there any apprenticeship programs or anything like that where you can get them as they come out of high school, train them for a couple of years, maybe within state, and then they can graduate at 21 to interstate driving?
Right. So I probably need to qualify my earlier comment. You know, obviously truck drivers for interstate commerce have to be 21. However, if you look almost across the entire United States, if a driver's driving in intrastate commerce, most states allow them to be 18. The difficulty is for trucking companies, most trucking companies handle a majority of interstate freight, not intrastate solely. However, DOT recently announced over the last few months that they are working with Department of Labor on an apprenticeship program where you could take 18-year-olds in. They have to have so much time behind the wheel with the trainer. There has to be additional classroom. I think that they're going to try to get more drivers in that way, but it's going to be a drop in the bucket. And I don't know how many companies, trucking companies, are going to want to dedicate that much time because there's quite a bit of classroom and additional in-truck time with a trainer. So you have to have that second person in the truck. So it'll be interesting to see how many companies take Department of Transportation and Labor up on that program.
We had a question from Ross Jennings. Ross, do you want to ask that question?
Sure. Will the logistics mess lead to a significant increase in American industrial production because of import substitution?
I can jump in on that one. I think that there will be an increase in US production, but I would attribute that more to broader geopolitical and macroeconomic trends than specifically this definitely doesn't hurt that purpose, but I do think there'll be more final assembly of products in the near future. I don't think that it's not going to be a huge amount, I think, because I think that a lot of companies might, for reasons having to do with fissures in the US-China relationship, for instance, will be potentially on the margins, to be clear, looking at other locations to shift some of that production. But that's only, I think, a small sliver. I think China has the economies of scale and the infrastructure that and just the size of the domestic market for companies that also want to sell into the Chinese market, that it's not really feasible in most cases. It's only really applicable to those companies that produce those, like, I would say, high labor intensive, low cost products that are not destined for the Chinese market as well. And those goods will probably shift to other low cost locations, they won't be repatriated. So I think that, and there are some instances certainly where, like, certain types especially around products that are deemed sensitive from a national security standpoint, that you could see some of the high tech production be repatriated. And the two bills that are being deliberated right now in Congress around that are certainly focused on how to encourage and incentivize some of that manufacturing to return. So there could be some, but I don't think it's going to have a huge impact, to be honest. I think it'll be very specific. But it could have an impact, and I think this could be something perhaps Tong could speak to, but I think you'd speak to, but it could have an impact on the shifting or reconfiguring of supply chains. If we do see that there's a lot of movement of, for instance, like textile production from China to either Southeast Asia or even Latin America, That could potentially have an impact on the amount of volume that's being processed and handled at the port on the Northwest Seaport lines. Tom, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, Spencer. I would say that we definitely have seen since 2018, even before that, we definitely have seen the growth of Southeast Asia countries emerging as sourcing for U.S. importers. But I would say this, China remains to be number one in terms of two-way trade for some of the reasons that Spencer cited, the scale of production and the experienced labor force. It is not something that, frankly, other emerging markets like Vietnam or Thailand or Philippines can compete with in the short term anyways. So I do see that that is absolutely taking place. I think importers are looking for ways to diversify and mitigate their risks of putting all eggs in one basket, right?
So we have 2 remaining questions. So maybe we could go, because we're past the 5 o'clock, but maybe we could just go through these briefly. The first question is on one of the issues with recruiting women into trucking is potentially involves extensive wait times for on-the-job training within a company for newly licensed female drivers because of safety issues and pairing them with male trainers. This is a question from Jennifer Poole. Is that still an issue, Annette? Maybe you can comment on that. And we have one more question from Michael Shearer.
It was an issue for a while, but it's not as much now. One, because there was a rule that just kicked in this year. It's called entry-level driver training. And a lot of that training has shifted from companies to actually training schools. Those training schools are local, so you don't necessarily have to couple a new driver with a trainer where they're going to be gone for days and weeks at a time in a single cab. So clearly, if in the past, let's say you were training for a new driving job, you might get paired with a driver, and then you're in the sleeper berth, a male and a female that don't know each other in the same sleeper. And that is clearly problematic because most women don't want to be paired with some man they don't know in a little tiny cab. And there have been some issues there. I think a lot of the trucking companies, because they're looking for drivers so aggressively, they've found ways to work around those, even if they do have long haul programs. Either that or they'll put the female drivers into a cab by themselves once they've gone through their basic training, doing local haul, and then allow them to do that individual trucking by themselves, or try to find another female to pair them with.
And our last question is from Michael Shear, and the question is, how huge of a regulatory hurdle with the introduction of automation in the logistics and transportation industry will be for implementation of technology that is rapidly in development and testing? I bet both of you could probably address this from your own respective, positions. So
I'll defer that to Annette.
Okay.
Well, I think, at least from my perspective on the regulatory hurdle, is getting all the parties in the logistics and transportation industry to agree to what the platform would look like and how data would be shared. I work with a lot of 3PLs and a lot of brokers. They all have their kind of proprietary systems. They might have certain kinds of software that they use, and they like to pass data between them and their trucking companies a certain way. I think you have to kind of overcome all those barriers of systems that people have built up, whether it's a system that was built at the port, or a system that was built for a trucking company, or a system that was built for a broker or third-party logistics, or even a shipping line. You have to get them to agree that they're going to share that data more seamlessly. And I think that the federal government is probably in the best position to figure that out. It's just a matter of how long it's going to take them to get, over all those barriers.
And we have one hand up. So John, if you want to ask your question, just very briefly, that'd be great.
I can't be brief, but
okay.
I happen to be with a manufacturing company who saw what was about to happen, and followed the lead of others who got out of China for the very reasons that we're seeing. And we're a manufacturer, and we have brought everything into the States, Canada, and Mexico. And I'm not saying that solved everything, but we aren't stuck with 100 ships trying to offload in Long Beach or LA. The other issue is that the truck and delivery problem still hits us. We still can't get parts from one location to another to get a fully manufactured piece of goods ready to go out the door.
With that, I'll turn it back to Mon for any closing comments.
All right, thank you. So thank you, Spencer, Annette, and Tone for a great discussion. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event. And then have a good night.
Cool.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks,
Thank you.
Spencer.
Thank you.